Good morning, Meadowview. It is Friday, Good Friday, and it's sunrise here in Republic. I can't help but reflect on the fact that at sunrise in Jerusalem, so many years ago, that Jesus had been up all night, having been betrayed in the garden, and falsely tried and marched back and forth throughout the city of Jerusalem. And it was in these early morning hours that they were pleading with Pilate that he might be crucified. And that would ultimately be the decision that was made. And it would have been around 9 a.m. that he would have been crucified. And he would have hung on the cross for about 6 hours that day. And I want to read to you from Russ Ramsey again. In his book, Behold the King of Glory, just his reflection on crucifixion. You can find the crucifixion accounts in each of the Gospels, and I would encourage you to take some time today to read those. But I hope maybe this is a video that will encourage you and your family as you just remember Good Friday. I really do miss that we can't gather. Good Friday service is one of my favorite services of the year, as we come together to remember. And we can do that in our homes, and I challenge you to do that. But this is Ramsey's chapter on crucifixion from Luke 23, 26 through 46. He writes this: The journey from Cyrene in northern Africa to Jerusalem gave Simon plenty of time to build anticipation in the minds of his sons Rufus and Alexander. They set out from their home with images in their mind of the gleaming gold city of David, expecting it to come into view with the cresting of every ridge. They knew they were getting close when the roads became chocked with pilgrims like them flooding in from all over the world. And Simon warned Rufus and Alexander to stay at his side. It would be easy to get separated. Early Friday morning on the day of the Passover feast, Simon and his sons heard a commotion and saw a throng of people pressing in to catch a glimpse, though of what he couldn't say. Curious, Simon tried to see what was happening, only to find that the throng was moving towards them. The crowd sounded angry, shouting impassioned pleas and scornful rebukes. Roman soldiers cleared the way to keep the procession moving. Simon saw what looked like the top of a large beam of wood rise occasionally above the heads of the approaching crowd, and with it the sound of scraping stone. Before they could get out of the way, Simon and his sons were enveloped in the mob and swept along. Then Simon saw an unrecognizably bloody man with the wooden beam on his back stagger toward him and fall to the ground. The man lay on the stone street, gasping for air, unable to stand. Simon gathered enough bits of the jeers and pleas from the crowd and soldiers to realize that this man was a political prisoner from Nazareth named Jesus, on his way to Golgotha, the hill of the skull. The soldiers treated their prisoners with impersonal contempt. They had only just reported the duty when Pilate handed Jesus over to them. They knew their job. Political prisoners accused of insurrection received the same basic treatment. The soldiers would crucify him, but first they would humiliate and abuse him in order to create a public spectacle that would serve as a warning to anyone who might oppose Rome. Mockery and scourging were part of the process. The soldiers learned early to keep their hearts out of the work. They were simply following orders, nothing more. When they stripped Jesus naked and flogged him with the cat o' nine tails, when they covered his shredded back with Herod's royal robe and pressed the crown of thorns on his brow, and when they took turns pretending to bow to him, shouting, "Hail, King of the Jews," doubling over in laughter and then spit on him and hit him with sticks, they were only in the first phase of their task, humiliation and abuse. After this, they put his clothes back on him and marched him out of the streets to carry his cross to the Mount of Crucifixion outside of the city walls. The sight of Jesus, the man Simon saw breathing heavily on the ground moved the people around him to be horrified and moved them to horrified lament. He looked so despised and rejected, so crushed by God that people had to hide their faces from him. The soldiers could see that they had taken the last bit of their prisoner's strength too soon. If they were going to make it to Golgotha, someone would have to carry Jesus' cross the rest of the way. So the captain of the guard looked for the nearest able-bodied pilgrim to relieve their broken prisoner of his burden. "You there," the soldiers barked at Simon. "Take up that cross and follow us." When they arrived at Golgotha, one of the soldiers produced a sign he had been carrying, the sign that would hang over the dying man's head detailing his crime. The chief priests were upset when they saw the sign Pilate had made, and in 3 languages, Greek, Latin, and Aramaic, the sign read, "The King of the Jews." The chief priests went to argue with Pilate, demanding that the sign should say Jesus only claimed to be the King of the Jews, not that he actually was. This was a matter of clarity. The whole world would read the sign. Precision mattered. They argued. With a hint of satisfaction, Pilate shrugged and said, "What I've written, I've written." While the chief priests were arguing over the wording of the sign, the soldiers were preparing Jesus for crucifixion. And 2 other men, convicted thieves, arrived at Golgotha with Jesus, each carrying a cross of his own. John, together with Jesus' mother, Mary, and Mary's sister, and Mary Magdalene, were in the crowd, gathering their courage as they went along. They watched helplessly as the guards peeled Jesus' tunic off his bleeding back so they could fix him to his cross. The soldiers drove large nails through each of Jesus' wrists into the crossbeam. With both hands nailed in place, they set his beam on the post in the ground and drove another nail through his gathered feet on the angled platform. The platform required the dying man to bend his knees, turning his legs to one side, contorting his torso. Once the soldiers had Jesus in place, they nailed Pilate's sign above his head, "The King of the Jews." They did the same with the other 2 condemned men. As the first waves of agony swept across Jesus' hanging body, he prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." The soldiers turned their attention to the pile of garments on the ground, and they began to divide them amongst themselves. Jesus' clothes landed in a pile with the other 2 thieves' garments. One of the soldiers picked up a tunic John recognized immediately. He could have picked it out of a pile any day, seamlessly woven from one continuous thread from top to bottom. How many times had he handed that tunic to Jesus over the years? John watched as the soldiers handled it as though it were a prize. They didn't want to tear it, so they cast lots to see who would win it. Few things seem more final than giving away a man's clothes. The chief priest focused on the wording of the sign. Pilate focused on the priest's displeasure. The soldiers focused on doomed men's clothes. John and Jesus' mother, Mary, focused on the one they loved as their hearts broke. Mary thought about how the old cleric, Simeon, had told her years ago that her son would grow into a man who would cause the rising and falling of many in Israel, and how through him the thoughts of many hearts would be revealed. She remembered how serious Simeon looked when he drew her close and said, "And a sword will pierce your soul too, dear woman." She thought of the night in Bethlehem and how her sweet husband made the best he could of an empty stable. How he wiped the sweat off her brow as she pushed and pushed until her baby boy was born. She thought about Herod's paranoid attempt to rid the world of the rumored king the sign over Jesus' head declared him to be. And now, with every labored breath, that sword was pulled a little deeper through a broken heart. John, who had fled in fear from Jesus in the garden, had now traded in his fear for grief over the suffering of his closest friend. Jesus looked at Mary and John wrapped in each other's arms, and he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." And to John he said, "John, she's your mother now." Even as they wept over losing him, he gave them to each other, and the soldiers continued their public humiliation. They shouted, "If you're the Son of God, come down from there. Save yourself, King of Israel. Come down and we'll believe you." One of the soldiers lifted a sponge soaked in sour wine to Jesus' lips. "You must be thirsty up there. Would you like a drink?" Then one of the thieves started in with contemptuous words of his own, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and save us." But the gravity of the scene settled in on the other thief. Jesus took the brutality of his captors to God in the form of prayer for mercy. He gave his own grieving mother his treasured friend. The crowds mocked the idea that Jesus could have been a king. And yet he endured this travail with the strength for which no one could account. Seeing the grace by which Jesus received this death, the second thief broke into sobs, saying to Jesus, "Forgive me. I am here for the wrongs that I've done, but you have done nothing. Please remember me when you pass from this place into your waiting kingdom." And Jesus said, "Today you will be with me in my glory." The weight of Jesus' body pulled down on his arms and shoulders. Compacting his twisted torso in this position, he could breathe in, but to breathe out, he would have to straighten himself to relieve the tension on his diaphragm and relax the torque of his muscles he used to exhale. To do this, he had to pull himself up by his wrists and push with his feet, both of which were fixed to the cross by nails. Every breath cost precious strength and delivered unbearable agony, resulting in shallow breathing, which limited the supply of oxygen to his blood, which in turn caused muscle cramps and spasms and fatigue, all of which made it even more difficult to come up for another painful breath, creating a cycle of searing pain and suffocation. Death by crucifixion normally took at least a day. The combination of trauma and blood loss Jesus had already suffered left him close to death by the time he was lifted up to die at 9 that Friday morning. By noon, 3 hours into his crucifixion, a strange darkness had crept over the land. The darkness stayed for the next 3 hours, filling the crowds with an eerie apprehension. The few words he spoke came in short, terse bursts and hand-won breath. Hard-won breath. As 3 in the afternoon approached, Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Startled by the outburst, people said, "Listen, he's calling for Elijah." And they watched him to see what he would do. And Jesus whispered, "I thirst." Someone lifted another sponge of sour wine to his lips, and this time he sipped what he could draw. Swallowing was almost as difficult as breathing. After taking the wine, he pushed up for another breath, as a look of excruciating pain spread across his face. He looked at the remaining crowd and said, "It is finished." A spasm seized his body, straightening his frame as much as his wrists and feet would allow. And he screamed out in agony and gasped again, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And after this, his body relaxed. He hung his head, and he breathed his last breath and died.